The millionaire's daughter is stunned when she sees a flower seller who looks just like her, wearing a pendant. The same one her father gave her 18 years ago. Samantha's mind was a whirlwind as she exited Central Park. The cool breeze nipped at her cheeks, but she barely felt it. Each step echoed with a growing sense of urgency. Heather Evans. The name burned in her thoughts, just as the image of the girl's face refused to fade from her memory. The butterfly pendant around Heather's neck was no ordinary trinket. It was a clue, a whisper from the past begging to be heard. She entered the grand lobby of her father's building, the marble floors gleaming under the soft glow of crystal chandeliers. The receptionist greeted her with a polite smile, but Samantha barely acknowledged it. She walked briskly to the elevator, her heels clicking with determination. As the doors slid shut, she inhaled deeply, bracing herself. Her father's office was on the 32nd floor, a penthouse of glass and steel with panoramic views of the city. John Reed's empire stretched out before him, a kingdom of skyscrapers and wealth that seemed to touch the clouds. Samantha often wondered if he ever felt lonely ruling from such heights. When she entered his office, he was on the phone, his brow furrowed, his voice a low growl of authority. He glanced at her, held up a finger for patience, and continued his conversation. Samantha's stomach twisted, but she stood her ground. After what felt like an eternity, he ended the call and turned his attention to her. "Samantha," he said, a thin smile on his lips. "To what do I owe this surprise visit?" She swallowed, her throat dry. "I need to ask you something." He leaned back in his chair, his steely blue eyes studying her. "Go ahead." Her fingers clenched around the strap of her purse. "Does the name Heather Evans mean anything to you?" John's smile faltered for a brief moment, just a flicker, but Samantha saw it. His jaw tightened, and he leaned forward slightly, the air in the room shifting. "Why are you asking about that?" "I met her today," she said, her voice trembling. "She looks exactly like me, and she was wearing this." She touched the butterfly pendant around her neck. "The same necklace you gave me when I was 2. John's face went pale, his eyes darting away. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. "Dad, who is she?" Samantha pressed, her voice rising. "Why does she look like me? Why does she have the same pendant?" He sighed heavily, running a hand through his silver hair. His gaze softened, but there was a shadow in his eyes, a weight he had carried for years. "It's time you knew the truth," he said, his voice low and strained. "Heather is your sister." Samantha felt like the floor had vanished beneath her feet. "What?" she whispered, her head spinning. John's eyes shimmered with guilt. 18 years ago, your sister was kidnapped. We were at a charity event and I let go of her hand for just a moment. When I turned around, she was gone. We searched everywhere, hired investigators, even paid ransoms to con artists who claimed they had her. But she never came back. Her vision blurred with tears. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" He swallowed hard. "I thought I was protecting you. The media would have torn us apart, and I couldn't face the guilt. I couldn't admit that I had failed to protect my own daughter." The walls of Samantha's world crumbled around her. Her sister. She had a sister who had lived a life so different from hers, a life of hardship and loss, and she'd never known. She wiped away a tear, her voice shaking. "Why didn't you keep looking?" John's hands trembled. "I did, for years, but there were no leads, no clues. Eventually, I had to accept that she was gone." "No," Samantha said firmly. "She's not gone. She's alive. I met her today, and she deserves to know the truth." He looked at her, pain etched deep in his features. "What are you going to do?" She stood, her resolve hardening like steel. "I'm going to make this right. Heather deserves more than secrets and lies. She deserves to know she has a family." John nodded slowly, his shoulders slumping. "Be careful, Samantha. The truth isn't always easy to face." She turned and left the office, her heart pounding in her chest. The weight of the revelation pressed on her, but beneath it was a fierce determination. Heather had spent years in the shadows, forgotten by a family who should have protected her. Samantha wouldn't let that continue. As she exited the building, the city felt different, sharper, colder. The noise of traffic and the hum of life blended into a background buzz as her thoughts raced ahead. Heather's guarded eyes haunted her, Gaining her trust wouldn't be easy, but Samantha was determined to try. Heather Evans wasn't just a stranger with a familiar face. She was family, and no matter how long it took, Samantha was going to prove that family meant something more than just a shared history. She hailed a cab, giving the driver the address she remembered from Heather's flower stand. The car pulled away from the curb, and Samantha clenched her fists, bracing herself for what was to come. This was just the beginning. The cab ride felt like it stretched for hours. Samantha's mind was a blur of questions, each one sharper than the last. Her father's confession echoed in her head. Heather is your sister. The words didn't feel real, like they belonged to someone else's life, not hers. As the cab neared Central Park, Samantha leaned forward, her voice tense. "Drop me off here, please." The driver pulled over, and Samantha paid quickly, stepping onto the sidewalk. The sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the park. The flower stand was still there, nestled under the same cluster of trees, but Heather was gone. A worn-out sign reading "back in 10 minutes" hung crookedly from the table. Samantha's heart thumped painfully. She paced in front of the stand, chewing her lip, each minute stretching out unbearably, just as she was about to give up. She heard footsteps behind her. "You again?" Heather's voice was guarded. Samantha turned. Heather stood a few feet away, a paper bag in one hand, a look of wary suspicion on her face. "I needed to see you," Samantha said, her voice trembling. Heather's eyes narrowed. "Why? Because I know who you are." Heather's brow furrowed. "What are you talking about?" Samantha took a deep breath. "You're my sister." The bag in Heather's hand slipped and hit the ground, the contents spilling onto the pavement. She didn't seem to notice. Her eyes widened, the color draining from her face. "What did you just say?" "You're my sister." "Heather?" Samantha repeated, tears threatening to spill. "My father told me the truth. You were kidnapped 18 years ago. He thought you were gone forever." Heather stumbled back a step, her face contorted with confusion and anger. "That's impossible. I've never had a family. I grew up in an orphanage, completely alone." "I know it's hard to believe," Samantha said, her voice softening. "But it's true. The butterfly pendant, it's proof. My father gave me the same one when I was 2 years old. He said it was unique, custom-made. There's no way it's a coincidence." Heather's hand flew to the pendant around her neck, her fingers shaking. She opened her mouth, closed it, then took a shuddering breath. "No," she whispered. "No, this doesn't make sense." Samantha took a cautious step closer. "I'm not here to hurt you. I need to know you. We need to figure this out together." Heather's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "Why would your father give up on me? Why didn't he find me?" Samantha's throat tightened. "He didn't give up. He looked for you for years. He just didn't know where to look." Heather's laugh was hollow, bitter. "You expect me to believe that? That a man with all the money in the world couldn't find his own daughter?" Samantha flinched. "I don't know why it happened the way it did, but I promise you, I didn't know about you until today." Heather turned away, her shoulders trembling. "This doesn't change anything. I've built a life. It may not be much, but it's mine. I don't need your pity." "It's not pity," Samantha said, her voice firm. "It's family. You're not alone, Heather." Heather spun around, her eyes blazing. "Family. You think saying that makes it true? I spent my entire life wishing for a family that never came. And now, out of nowhere, you show up with this story and expect me to believe it." "I don't expect anything," Samantha replied, her own voice rising. "But I'm not going to walk away from you. Not now, not ever." They stood in silence, the weight of years pressing down on them. Finally, Heather's anger seemed to drain away, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion. She rubbed her temples, sighing heavily. "What do you want from me?" she whispered. "Just a chance," Samantha said. "A chance to get to know you, to figure out what happened, please." Heather's eyes searched Samantha's face, looking for cracks, for lies. What she found instead was sincerity, raw and unguarded. She nodded slowly, her voice barely audible. "One chance, that's all." Relief flooded Samantha. "Thank you." Heather took a shaky breath, her walls still partially up. "So, where do we go from here?" Samantha hesitated. "Will you come with me? I want you to meet our father. I know it's a lot to ask, but he needs to see you." To know you're alive. Heather's jaw clenched, her eyes flashing with a mix of fear and defiance. I don't know if I can do that. Not now, Samantha said gently. When you're ready, just think about it. Heather looked away, staring at the fading sunlight filtering through the trees. After a long moment, she nodded. Okay, I'll think about it. Samantha felt a fragile hope bloom in her chest. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As they stood there, two strangers bound by an invisible thread of blood and loss, the world around them continued on, indifferent, uncaring. But for Samantha and Heather, everything had changed. Samantha's heart was still pounding as she walked back toward Fifth Avenue, Heather's parting words echoing in her mind. One chance, that's all. It wasn't much, but it was something. For now, it was a thread she could cling to, a fragile hope that things might somehow fall into place. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She glanced at the screen. It was a message from her father. John Reed. Did you speak with her? Samantha hesitated, her thumb hovering over the screen. How could she explain what had just happened? How could she describe the hurricane of emotions they'd both been through in just a few minutes? Samantha? Yes, it's complicated. His reply came almost immediately. John Reed, come home. We need to talk. A wave of exhaustion hit her. She hailed a cab and slid into the back seat, leaning her head against the window. The city blurred past, the lights of Manhattan shimmering like distant stars. As much as she wanted answers, she dreaded this conversation. When she arrived at the penthouse, the air felt heavier than usual. The door clicked shut behind her, the sound reverberating through the cold, sterile space. Her father was standing by the window, his silhouette outlined against the cityscape. He turned as she entered, his face lined with worry. Did she agree to meet me? Samantha shook her head. Not yet. She said she'd think about it. He nodded, his eyes clouded. I can't blame her. She's angry, Samantha said, her voice tight. She feels abandoned. She doesn't trust me, and I don't think she ever will trust you. John's jaw clenched. I deserve that. Samantha folded her arms, her gaze hardening. Why did you keep this from me all these years? I thought I was an only child. You let me believe that while my sister was out there, alone, struggling to survive. He sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. I thought I was protecting you. After the kidnapping, I was terrified something might happen to you too. I thought if I kept it quiet, if I buried the past, we could all move on. She shook her head, tears stinging her eyes. You don't get to decide what we can move on from. His face crumbled, the weight of his guilt dragging him down. I know, and I regret every moment of it. For a while, neither of them spoke. The silence was filled with everything they couldn't say, the pain of choices that couldn't be undone. Finally, Samantha exhaled slowly. She's not going to come here. Not yet. If you want to fix this, you're going to have to show her that you care. John's eyes met hers. What do you suggest? Give her space. Let me try to reach her first. Samantha's voice softened. If we rush this, we'll lose her forever. He nodded, his shoulders sagging. I trust you. Samantha wasn't sure she trusted herself, but she knew she had to try. The next morning, Samantha woke early. The memory of her conversation with Heather weighed on her. She replayed every word, every glance, trying to understand the depth of Heather's anger and mistrust. It wasn't just about being abandoned. It was about surviving without anyone to lean on. She grabbed her phone and typed out a message. Samantha, hey, I know you probably don't want to see me right now, but would you let me buy you a coffee just to talk? No pressure. She hesitated, then hit send. Her stomach twisted as she stared at the screen, waiting for a reply. Minutes passed, then an hour. Nothing. Disappointment settled over her like a heavy blanket. Maybe this was too much to hope for. Maybe Heather would never let her in, just as she was about to give up. Her phone buzzed. Heather, fine. 1 coffee, 2 p.m. at that cafe on 7th. Don't be late. Relief washed over her. Mingling with nerves, she quickly replied, Samantha, I'll be there. The cafe on 7th Avenue was a small, cozy place, the air rich with the scent of roasted beans and freshly baked pastries. Samantha arrived 10 minutes early, her nerves buzzing. She chose a table by the window and ordered 2 coffees, her hands trembling slightly. At exactly 2 p.m., the door jingled, and Heather walked in. She looked different in the daylight, more vulnerable. The shadows under her eyes more pronounced. She wore the same worn sweater, her fingers tucked into the sleeves as if she were trying to shield herself from the world. Heather's gaze found Samantha, and she approached cautiously, her expression unreadable. "You're early," Heather said, sliding into the chair across from her. Samantha smiled faintly. "I didn't want to keep you waiting." Heather glanced at the coffee on the table. "So, what do you want? To get to know you?" Samantha said honestly. "I want to understand your life, and I want you to understand mine." Heather's eyes flickered with hesitation. She picked up the coffee, wrapping her fingers around the warm cup. "I don't even know where to start." "Anywhere," Samantha said softly. "Start anywhere." Heather took a deep breath, her gaze distant. "I don't remember much before the orphanage. Just flashes. A woman's voice, a warm hand. Then nothing." Samantha's heart clenched. "I'm sorry." Heather's eyes snapped back to hers. "Don't apologize. You didn't do this to me." "I know," Samantha whispered, "but I want to help fix it if you let me." Heather stared at her for a long moment, her eyes filled with a mix of hope and fear. "We'll see," she said quietly. It wasn't a promise, but it was enough for now. The air between them felt fragile, like the surface of a frozen lake, ready to crack at the slightest wrong step. Heather's eyes flicked to the window, her fingers still wrapped tightly around the coffee cup. She wasn't drinking it. She was just holding it, as though it anchored her. Samantha took a slow breath, careful not to push too hard. "What happened after the orphanage?" she asked gently. Heather's jaw tightened. "I bounced around a lot. Foster homes, group homes. None of them lasted." She laughed bitterly. "Turns out, nobody wants a kid with trust issues and a bad attitude." Samantha's heart ached. The idea of Heather, her sister, growing up alone and unwanted, twisted a knife in her gut. "That wasn't your fault." Heather's eyes snapped back to hers, sharp and wary. "Don't do that." "Do what?" Samantha asked, confused. "Act like you know me, like you understand," Heather said, her voice tight. "We've known each other for, 24 hours? You've lived a life of penthouses and private schools. I've lived something else, so don't pretend you get it." Samantha flinched but nodded. "You're right. I don't know what you've been through, but I want to. I want to understand." Heather's gaze softened slightly, though the wall between them remained. Why do you even care?" Samantha looked down at her hands, then back at Heather. "Because you're my sister. I spent my whole life believing I was an only child, knowing that you were out there, struggling. It makes me feel like everything I thought was real isn't." Heather let out a long breath, her shoulders sagging. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted. "Letting people in, trusting them. Every time I tried, it backfired." Samantha leaned forward, her voice earnest. "Then let's take it slow. No expectations, no pressure, just two people figuring things out." Heather studied her for a moment, then nodded reluctantly. "Okay, slow." Relief washed over Samantha. It was a small concession, but it was something. "Can I ask you one more thing?" Heather's lips twitched in something that almost resembled a smile. "That depends." "Why the flowers?" Samantha asked. "Why work at a flower stand?" Heather's gaze grew distant. "They're simple, honest. They don't pretend to be something they're not. And for a few bucks, they can make someone's day a little better, I guess." "I like that." Samantha smiled softly. "I get that." A silence settled between them, not as sharp as before. It was a silence that held possibilities. A fragile beginning. Not yet solid, but not entirely broken either. Heather glanced at the clock on the wall. "I should get back to work." Samantha's heart sank, but she nodded. "Can I walk you back?" Heather hesitated, then shrugged. "Sure." They left the cafe together, the cold wind biting at their cheeks as they stepped onto the sidewalk. Samantha shoved her hands into her pockets, falling into step beside Heather. The city's noise buzzed around them, honking taxis, snippets of conversation, the rhythmic clatter of heels on pavement. But between them, it was quiet. As they neared the flower stand, Heather paused, her eyes flicking to Samantha. "This is where I leave you." Samantha nodded. "I'll see you again." Heather looked away, her expression guarded. "Maybe." It wasn't a promise, but Samantha held onto it anyway. Okay, take care. Heather gave a small nod and turned back to her stand. Samantha watched her for a moment, the wind tugging at her hair. Then she walked away, the weight of uncertainty pressing on her shoulders. That evening, Samantha sat in her bedroom, staring at the ceiling. The sun had long set, and the city's lights glittered through the massive windows. She replayed her conversation with Heather over and over, dissecting every word, every hesitation. There was a barrier between them, a barrier Samantha was determined to break down, no matter how long it took. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. She grabbed it, her heart leaping with hope. But it wasn't Heather. It was her father, John Reed. "Did you make any progress?" Samantha sighed, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Finally, she replied, "Samantha, it's going to take time, but I think she's willing to try." A moment later, his response came, "John Reed, I want to help. Tell me what I can do." She stared at the message, conflicted. Part of her wanted to push him away, to make him understand how deeply his secrets had hurt them. But another part of her knew that he was just as broken by this as they were. "Samantha, give her space. Let me handle this for now." His reply was brief. "John Reed, okay, I trust you." She put the phone down and leaned back, exhaustion seeping into her bones. The world she thought she knew was unraveling, and she had no idea where it would end. But she wasn't going to give up. Heather deserved a family, a real one, and Samantha was going to do everything she could to make that happen. For now, it was enough to hope. The next morning, Samantha sat at the breakfast table, absently stirring her coffee. The sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting a warm glow on the pristine marble countertops and polished oak floors. But the brightness of the morning did little to ease the heaviness in her chest. John Reed entered the kitchen, his presence quiet but imposing. He glanced at his daughter, taking in her distracted expression. "Did you sleep at all?" he asked softly. Samantha shrugged, her eyes fixed on the swirling coffee. "A little." He sat down across from her, folding his hands on the table. "I know you're carrying a lot right now, and I know I've put you in this position." She finally looked up, her gaze sharp. "You didn't just put me in this position, Dad. You put Heather there too, alone." John's eyes flinched, the guilt plain on his face. "I know, and I'll never forgive myself for it." Silence stretched between them. Samantha wrestled with the urge to lash out, to demand answers that would somehow make everything okay. But she knew there were no simple answers, no quick fixes. Instead, she asked, "Why didn't you tell Mom?" Her father's face paled. He looked away, his jaw clenching. "Your mother, she wasn't strong enough to handle something like that. She was fragile. You remember how she was?" Samantha nodded reluctantly. Her mother had been a delicate woman, easily overwhelmed by the pressures of their world. The loss of a child might have broken her completely. "I thought keeping it a secret was the best way to protect her. And you," John said, his voice low. "But all I did was build a wall of lies." Samantha's fingers tightened around her coffee cup. "We have to break that wall down. No more secrets." John met her gaze, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "I want to help. I want to make things right with Heather." "She doesn't trust you," Samantha said bluntly. "She barely trusts me." "Then what can I do?" he asked desperately. "Be patient," she replied. "And be ready. Because when she decides to face you, you'll need to be the father she deserves." John nodded, his face lined with determination. "I will." Later that afternoon, Samantha walked through the bustling streets of Manhattan, her thoughts a tangled mess. Heather hadn't responded to her last message, and the silence gnawed at her. Each unanswered text felt like a door closing, a chance slipping away. She turned a corner and found herself in front of Heather's flower stand. To her relief, Heather was there, arranging a fresh batch of roses, the sight of her sister, her flesh and blood, working so diligently with her hands sent a pang of emotion through Samantha. Heather looked up and met her gaze, her expression unreadable. "You again. I didn't want to just text," Samantha said. "I wanted to see how you were doing." Heather's lips twisted into a wry smile. "I'm the same as always, busy surviving." Samantha hesitated. "Can I help you? Maybe we can talk while you work." Heather's eyes narrowed. "Why are you so determined to fix this? To fix me?" Samantha's throat tightened. "Because I want to be your sister, I want to know you. Isn't that worth trying for? Heather's shoulders stiffened. You don't get it. I don't know how to have a sister. I don't know how to trust anyone. Samantha stepped closer, her voice gentle. Then let's figure it out together. No expectations, no pressure. Just let me be here. Heather's eyes softened, the wall between them cracking just a little. She nodded grudgingly. Fine. Hand me those daisies. Samantha smiled and picked up the bundle of daisies, carefully handing them over. For a few minutes, they worked side by side, the silence between them no longer uncomfortable. It was a small step, but it felt monumental. As Heather wrapped the flowers, she glanced at Samantha. So, what's it like, being rich? I mean, Samantha laughed softly. Overrated. It's a lot of expectations. A lot of pretending. Sometimes I wonder if any of it really matters. Heather smirked. Must be nice to have the option to wonder. Samantha winced, but nodded. Yeah, I guess it is. Heather sighed, her fingers brushing the butterfly pendant. Sometimes I wonder what my life would have been like if I hadn't been taken. If I'd grown up with you, maybe it would have been easier, Samantha said softly. Or maybe not. But we can't change the past. Heather's eyes darkened. No, we can't. And some things are too broken to fix. Samantha's chest ached. I don't believe that. I think we can rebuild even if it's not perfect. Heather studied her, the shadows in her eyes deepening. You're more optimistic than I am. Maybe, Samantha admitted, but I'm willing to fight for this. Heather's expression flickered with something. Hope, fear, vulnerability. She opened her mouth to say something when a figure appeared at the edge of the stand. It was an older woman. With sharp gray eyes and a face lined with experience, she wore a simple coat, but there was something rigid about her posture. Heather, the woman said curtly, you're late for your break. Heather's face hardened. I'll be done in a minute. The woman's gaze slid over to Samantha, assessing her coldly. Who's this? Samantha's skin prickled under the woman's scrutiny. I'm her sister. The woman's eyes narrowed, suspicion flaring. Heather doesn't have a sister. Heather's jaw clenched, her voice tight. Not now, Mrs. Jenkins. Mrs. Jenkins snorted. Fine, don't be long. She turned and walked away, her presence leaving a chill in the air. Samantha frowned. Who was that? My boss, Heather muttered. Don't mind her. She's just protective. Samantha nodded, sensing there was more to the story, but now wasn't the time to push. Okay, I'll let you get back to work. Heather nodded, her expression weary. Thanks for stopping by. Samantha smiled softly. I'll see you soon. As she walked away, the distance between them felt smaller, the hope a little brighter. The wind bit at Samantha's cheeks as she walked away from Heather's flower stand. The encounter with Mrs. Jenkins left a sour taste in her mouth. There was something about the woman's cold eyes and clipped tone that made her stomach churn, but she pushed the thought aside. Heather had agreed to let her in, just a little, and she couldn't afford to let paranoia ruin the fragile progress they'd made. Samantha turned onto Fifth Avenue, the familiar sights and sounds of Manhattan buzzing around her. Luxury boutiques, well-dressed professionals, and tourists snapping photos of towering buildings. This world was her world, a bubble of privilege and polished appearances. But now, it felt hollow. As she stepped into the gleaming marble lobby of her father's building, a wave of exhaustion hit her. The weight of the secret she carried, of Heather's existence, of their fractured family, pressed down on her shoulders. Samantha, a familiar voice called her name. She turned to see her father's assistant, Marlene, approaching with a tight smile. Your father's in a meeting, but he wants you to wait in his office. He said it's urgent. Samantha nodded, her pulse quickening. Thanks, Marlene. She took the elevator up to the 32nd floor, the ride feeling longer than usual. When the doors slid open, she walked down the hallway, her heels muffled by the plush carpet. Her father's office door was ajar and she pushed it open. Stepping inside, the room smelled faintly of leather and coffee. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the skyline, and the sun reflected off the glass, casting long shadows across the sleek furniture. Samantha sank into the chair opposite her father's desk, trying to ignore the knot of anxiety in her stomach. Moments later, John Reed entered the office, his brow furrowed and his expression strained. He closed the door behind him, his eyes meeting hers. "You saw her again." Samantha nodded. "Yeah, she let me help her with the flowers. It's a small step, but it's something," he sighed, sinking into his chair. "Thank you for doing this, for trying." She studied him, searching his face for any cracks in his carefully composed mask. "Dad, there's something that bothers me." He looked up, his gaze wary. "What is it?" "Her boss, Mrs. Jenkins," Samantha said. "She didn't seem right. She acted like she was more than just a boss. Like she was keeping an eye on Heather." John's eyes narrowed. "Mrs. Jenkins? What did she look like? Older, gray hair, sharp eyes, kind of stern?" He leaned back, his fingers steepled under his chin. A shadow crossed his face, dark and unsettling. "I'll look into it, Dad," Samantha said slowly. "Is there something you're not telling me?" His jaw tightened. "There are a lot of things I'm not proud of, Samantha, and a lot of people who would love to see me fall." Her stomach dropped. "You think someone's using Heather to get to you?" "I don't know," he admitted, "but we need to be careful." She shook her head, frustration bubbling up. "Heather's not a pawn in someone's game. She's your daughter, my sister." "I know," he said, his voice rough, "and I won't let anyone hurt her." Later that evening, Samantha sat in her bedroom, her laptop open in front of her. The glow from the screen illuminated her face as she scrolled through news articles and old reports about kidnappings and missing children. The details of Heather's disappearance were sparse, almost like they'd been buried on purpose. Her phone buzzed. A message from Heather. "Heather, you busy?" Samantha's heart leaped. She quickly replied, "Samantha, no, what's up?" A pause. Then another message. "Heather, can you meet me? There's something I need to talk about." "Samantha, of course, where?" "Heather, Central Park, the bench by the fountain." Samantha didn't waste time. She grabbed her coat and rushed out of the penthouse, her heart pounding with anticipation and worry. What did Heather want to talk about? Had something happened? The city was quieter at night, the usual chaos muted under a blanket of darkness. When she reached Central Park, the lamplights cast pools of golden light on the pathways. She spotted Heather sitting on the bench, her arms wrapped around herself, staring at the water. Samantha approached slowly. "Hey." Heather looked up, her face drawn and pale. "Hey." Samantha sat down next to her. "What's going on?" Heather took a deep breath, her fingers fiddling with the butterfly pendant. "Something weird happened today. After you left, Mrs. Jenkins asked me a lot of questions. About you." Samantha's brows knitted together. "What kind of questions?" "Like who you were, what you wanted. She didn't believe me when I said you were my sister. She got this look in her eyes like she was planning something." A chill crept down Samantha's spine. "Heather, I don't trust her." Heather nodded, her eyes clouded with uncertainty. "Me neither. But she's my boss if I lose this job." "You won't lose it," Samantha said firmly. "We'll figure something out." Heather sighed, leaning back against the bench. "I don't know what to do, Sam. It feels like my life is getting more complicated by the minute." Samantha's heart swelled at the sound of the nickname. The first time Heather had used it. "You don't have to figure it out alone. I'm here, and we'll get through this." Heather looked at her, vulnerability etched on her face. "I want to believe that." "Then believe it," Samantha said softly. "We're stronger together." For a moment, they sat in silence, the sounds of the city fading into the background. Two sisters bound by blood, separated by secrets, and now, maybe, finally finding their way back to each other. The chill of the night wrapped around them like a thin veil. Samantha and Heather sat side by side on the park bench, the silence between them filled with unspoken thoughts. The faint trickle of the fountain water blended with the distant hum of the city, a soft reminder that life continued to move forward, even when everything felt like it was standing still. Heather's fingers tapped lightly against her knee, a restless energy she couldn't seem to shake. "I used to come here a lot," she said suddenly, her voice quiet. "When I couldn't sleep, I'd walk to this bench and just sit. The water calmed me down." Samantha nodded, her heart twisting. "I wish I'd known. Maybe I was sitting in my room, looking out over this same park, completely unaware." Heather's lips curled into a small, sad smile. Two worlds, separated by a few blocks. "Funny, isn't it?" "Not funny," Samantha said softly. "Tragic," Heather glanced at her, studying her face. You know, part of me still thinks this is some elaborate prank, like any minute now someone's going to jump out and yell, "Gotcha!" Samantha shook her head. It's real, Heather. As unbelievable as it feels. It's real. And I want to figure it out with you. Heather sighed, her breath visible in the cold air. I don't even know where to start. Then we'll start here, Samantha said. Right now, just you and me, getting to know each other. Heather's eyes softened, the guarded edge easing just a little. Okay, but don't expect me to spill my life story all at once. I won't, Samantha promised. No rush. They fell silent again, but this time it felt different, less strained. There was a tentative comfort in knowing that neither of them had to pretend. Samantha shivered, pulling her coat tighter around her. It's freezing out here, Heather chuckled. You're not used to the cold, huh? All those heated penthouses and luxury cars. Samantha smirked. Guilty as charged, but I guess I could learn. Heather raised an eyebrow. You want to learn how to be cold? No, Samantha laughed. I want to learn what your world is like, the real world, not the bubble I grew up in. Heather tilted her head, considering. It's not always pretty, but it's honest. I could use some honesty, Samantha admitted. My whole life has been smoke and mirrors. Heather's expression shifted, a shadow passing over her face. Do you think your father was honest about everything? About me? Samantha hesitated, the question hanging heavy in the air. I don't know, but I promise you, if he's still hiding something, I'll find out. Heather nodded slowly, her eyes dark with thought. I want to believe you. Then let me prove it, Samantha said. We'll take this step by step. If there are more secrets, we'll uncover them together. Heather's jaw clenched. Secrets are like poison. They seep into everything. Samantha couldn't argue with that. Her entire life felt poisoned now, every memory tainted by the knowledge of what had been hidden from her. A sudden gust of wind swept through the park, rustling the leaves and making Heather shiver. Samantha noticed the thin sweater Heather wore and frowned. Here, she said, shrugging off her coat, rugging off. Take this. Heather's eyes widened. I'm not taking your coat. Come on, Samantha insisted, draping it over Heather's shoulders. You're freezing. Heather pulled the coat tighter, her expression conflicted. Thanks. It's just a coat, Samantha said with a shrug. No, Heather replied softly. It's more than that. They sat there, wrapped in the warmth of fragile understanding. For the first time, the gap between their two worlds felt just a little smaller. The next morning, Samantha woke up feeling lighter. She hadn't expected one night in the park to change everything, but the small step forward with Heather gave her hope. She dressed quickly and headed to the kitchen, the smell of fresh coffee drifting through the penthouse. Her father was already there, a newspaper in front of him, though his eyes weren't focused on the words. He looked up when Samantha entered, his face lined with worry. How was your night? He asked carefully. It was good, she replied, pouring herself a cup of coffee. Heather and I talked. It's slow, but we're making progress. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. I'm glad. Samantha sat across from him, stirring her coffee. There's something else. He straightened, his eyes narrowing. What is it? Mrs. Jenkins, she said. She's more than just Heather's boss. I know you said you'd look into it, but I need you to take this seriously. Heather doesn't feel safe around her. His jaw tightened. I'll handle it. Don't just handle it, Dad, Samantha snapped. Tell me what you find out. No more secrets. He met her gaze, his eyes weary. I promise. She nodded, hoping he meant it. The weight of the past was too heavy to carry alone. If they were going to fix this family, it had to start with the truth. As she finished her coffee, her phone buzzed with a message. She glanced at the screen and smiled. Heather, thanks for the coat. Want to grab lunch later? Samantha's heart swelled. It was a small invitation, but it felt monumental. Samantha, I'd love to. Anywhere you want. The reply came quickly. Heather, there's a diner on 10th. Cheap but good. 1 p.m. Samantha, see you there. She slipped her phone into her pocket, hope fluttering in her chest. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, she felt like they were walking it together. Samantha checked her reflection in the mirror one last time before stepping out of the cab. She'd chosen a simple outfit: jeans, a sweater, and a worn leather jacket she hadn't touched in years. Nothing flashy, nothing that screamed privilege. She wanted Heather to see her as more than just the daughter of a billionaire. She wanted to be real. The diner on 10th Avenue was small and unassuming, its neon sign flickering slightly. The scent of frying bacon and fresh coffee drifted out each time the door swung open. Samantha took a breath and stepped inside. The bell above the door jingled, and she scanned the room. Heather was already there, sitting in a corner booth with her back to the wall. She wore the same thin sweater, Samantha's coat folded neatly beside her. Her fingers drummed lightly on the table, and her eyes flicked up as Samantha approached. "Hey," Samantha greeted with a smile. "Hey," Heather replied, her voice soft. "You're on time." "I didn't want to be late," Samantha said, sliding into the booth across from her. "I figured you'd appreciate that." Heather's lips quirked up. "I do." A waitress appeared, her notepad ready. "What can I get you two?" Heather didn't even glance at the menu. "Coffee, black, and a blot." Samantha hesitated for only a second. "Same for me." The waitress nodded and shuffled away. Samantha looked around the diner. Faded booths, scuffed linoleum, a jukebox in the corner that had seen better days. The low murmur of conversation and the clink of silverware filled the air. It was nothing like the pristine, hushed restaurants she was used to, but there was something comforting about it. Heather's fingers traced the edge of her coffee cup. "So, how's life in the ivory tower?" Samantha smiled wryly. "Overrated. Lots of rules, expectations, appearances to maintain. Sounds exhausting," Heather said, her eyes glinting with sarcasm. "It is." Samantha leaned back. "Honestly, I think I'd rather be here." Heather's gaze flicked up, searching her face. "You don't have to pretend." "I'm not," Samantha said earnestly. "Sometimes I wish I could just escape it all, be somewhere real, somewhere I don't have to put on a show." Heather studied her for a moment before nodding. "Fair enough," the waitress returned, placing their plates and coffee on the table. The smell of crispy bacon and toasted bread filled the air. Samantha took a bite of her blot and smiled. "Okay, this is good." Heather smirked. "Told you." They ate in companionable silence for a few moments. Samantha savored the normalcy of it. Two sisters sharing a meal. No pretenses, no expectations, just being. When they were halfway through their sandwiches, Heather set hers down, her expression turning serious. "I've been thinking about what you said. About Dad." Samantha's chest tightened. "What about it?" Heather's eyes darted away. "I don't know if I can face him. I mean, what do you even say to the man who forgot you existed?" "He didn't forget you," Samantha said softly. "He thought he lost you. He blames himself for everything." Heather let out a bitter laugh. "Good. He should." Samantha flinched, but she didn't argue. Heather's pain was real, raw, and justified. "I get it," she said quietly. "You have every right to be angry, but maybe giving him a chance to explain would help." Heather's jaw clenched. "I'm not ready." "That's okay," Samantha assured her. "You don't have to be ready now, or ever, if you decide that. It's your choice." Heather's fingers tapped the table, her eyes distant. "Choice. That's not something I've had a lot of." Samantha nodded, her heart aching. "I want you to have that now. Whatever you decide, I'll support it." Heather looked at her, vulnerability flashing in her eyes. "Why do you care so much? We just met." "Because you're my sister," Samantha said, her voice steady. "And I've spent too long not knowing you. I don't want to waste any more time." Heather swallowed hard, her gaze dropping to her coffee. "It's weird, having someone care." "I'm not going anywhere," Samantha promised. "No matter what." A heavy silence settled between them. Heather's walls were still up, but they were crumbling, piece by piece. Samantha could feel it, the possibility of trust, fragile and new. Heather sighed, her shoulders slumping. "I don't know what I'm doing, Sam. This is all too much." Samantha reached across the table and squeezed Heather's hand gently. "Then let's take it one step at a time. No pressure, no rush." Heather's eyes shimmered, and for a moment, she didn't pull away. "Okay, one step at a time." The bell above the door jingled, and Heather flinched, pulling her hand back. Samantha followed her gaze and saw Mrs. Jenkins standing in the doorway, her sharp eyes scanning the diner. When she spotted Heather, her lips pressed into a thin line. Heather's face went pale. "What is she doing here?" Mrs. Jenkins walked over, her heels clicking ominously against the floor. She stopped by the booth, her eyes flicking between Heather and Samantha. "Heather," she said coolly, "you're late getting back." Heather's voice was tight. "I'm on my break." Mrs. Jenkins's eyes narrowed. "Your break ended 5 minutes ago," Samantha bristled. "She's having lunch. Give her a minute." Mrs. Jenkins ignored her, focusing on Heather. "Come now." Heather hesitated, looking torn. Samantha leaned in, her voice low. "You don't have to go with her. We can figure this out." Heather shook her head. "I can't lose this job." Reluctantly, she grabbed Samantha's coat and slipped out of the booth. "I'll see you later." Samantha watched helplessly as Heather followed Mrs. Jenkins out of the diner, her shoulders hunched. A cold sense of dread settled in Samantha's gut. Something wasn't right, and she was going to find out what. Samantha watched through the diner's window as Heather walked away with Mrs. Jenkins. The woman's hand rested firmly on Heather's shoulder, fingers gripping just a little too tightly. There was something possessive, almost threatening, in the way Mrs. Jenkins guided her away. A cold knot twisted in Samantha's stomach. She tossed a few bills onto the table and pushed out of the booth. Her mind buzzed with worry as she stepped onto the sidewalk. The winter air was sharp and biting, but it did nothing to clear the fog of unease in her head. She pulled out her phone and dialed her father. He answered on the second ring. "Samantha, Dad, we need to talk about Mrs. Jenkins now." His voice was cautious. "What happened?" "She just showed up at the diner, practically dragged Heather away. Something's off about her. I don't trust her." There was a pause. "I've been looking into her background. She doesn't have a criminal record, but there are inconsistencies in her employment history. Gaps, false references. I don't know who she really is." Samantha's heart sank. "What if she's dangerous?" His voice hardened. "I'm not going to let anything happen to Heather. I'll hire someone to keep an eye on her." "That's not enough," Samantha snapped. "We need to talk to Heather, get her away from Mrs. Jenkins before it's too late." "She might not listen," John said quietly. "She doesn't trust me. She barely trusts me," Samantha admitted. "But I'm not giving up on her." A long silence stretched between them. Finally, her father spoke, his voice low and resolute. "I'll keep digging. You stay close to Heather." "Okay," Samantha whispered. "Be careful, Dad." "I will," he promised. "You too." She ended the call and stuffed her phone into her pocket. The dread in her gut was growing, clawing at the edges of her thoughts. She had to find Heather, to warn her, to get her away from Mrs. Jenkins. But how? Heather's flower stand was empty when Samantha arrived. The buckets of flowers sat neglected, petals drooping, the air heavy with the scent of wilting roses. A cold shiver ran through her. This wasn't like Heather. She glanced around the park, scanning the paths for any sign of her sister. Nothing. Just joggers, tourists, and parents with strollers, all oblivious to the storm raging in Samantha's mind. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A text. "Heather, don't come looking for me. I'm fine." Samantha's fingers clenched around the device. This didn't sound like Heather. It was too abrupt, too dismissive. Her gut screamed that something was wrong. She quickly typed a reply. "Samantha, where are you? Please talk to me." No response. The 3 dots appeared, blinked for a moment, then vanished. Samantha's heart thudded painfully. Heather was being silenced. She was sure of it. She dialed Heather's number. It rang once, twice, then went to voicemail. Samantha gritted her teeth, frustration burning behind her eyes. Her mind raced through possibilities. If Heather wasn't at the flower stand, where else could she be? And then it hit her. The bench by the fountain. Their meeting spot. Maybe Heather went there. Needing space but not knowing where else to turn, Samantha didn't hesitate. She turned on her heel and sprinted toward Central Park, her breath coming in sharp bursts. The fountain came into view, the water catching the pale winter sunlight. Her eyes scanned the area, her heart pounding. There, sitting hunched on the bench, was Heather. Mrs. Jenkins stood beside her, one hand gripping Heather's arm. Samantha's chest tightened. She forced herself to stay calm, to think clearly. She approached, her steps deliberate. "Hey, Heather," she called out, trying to sound casual, even as fear coiled in her stomach. Heather's head snapped up, her eyes wide and desperate. "Samantha." Mrs. Jenkins turned slowly, her expression cold and composed. "You shouldn't be here," she said. Her voice clipped. Samantha ignored her, locking eyes with Heather. "I've been looking for you. Are you okay?" Heather hesitated, her lips trembling. I don't know." Mrs. Jenkins tightened her grip on Heather's arm. "She's fine. She just needs to get back to work. She can speak for herself," Samantha said, her voice hardening. "Let her go." Mrs. Jenkins' eyes narrowed. "You don't understand. Heather has responsibilities. She needs this job. No job is worth this," Samantha shot back. "Heather, if you want to leave, you can. You don't owe her anything." Heather's eyes darted between them. Fear and confusion etched on her face. "I don't know what to do. Trust me," Samantha whispered. "Please." For a long, agonizing moment, Heather was silent. Then, with a deep breath, she pulled her arm free from Mrs. Jenkins' grasp and stepped toward Samantha. Her voice was shaky but resolute. "I'm going with her." Mrs. Jenkins' face twisted in anger. "You're making a mistake." Heather's jaw clenched. "Maybe, but it's mine to make." Samantha took Heather's hand, squeezing it gently. "Let's go." They turned and walked away, their steps in sync, the air between them charged with tension. Samantha didn't look back, but she could feel Mrs. Jenkins' eyes boring into their backs, a silent promise of trouble to come. When they were a safe distance away, Samantha exhaled, her heart still racing. "You okay?" Heather nodded, though tears shimmered in her eyes. "I don't know what just happened, but thank you." "You don't have to thank me," Samantha said. "We're in this together now." Heather squeezed her hand. "Yeah, together." They kept walking, leaving the shadows of fear behind them. But Samantha knew this wasn't over. Mrs. Jenkins was a threat, and they needed answers before it was too late. Samantha's heart was still pounding as she and Heather left Central Park. They walked in silence, the city's sounds muffled by the roaring in Samantha's ears. Heather clutched Samantha's hand tightly, her knuckles white. It was as if she feared letting go would send her tumbling back into the chaos. They turned onto a quieter street, away from the traffic and crowds. Samantha stopped and faced Heather, her eyes filled with concern. "Are you okay?" Heather's breath trembled as she exhaled. "I don't know. It all happened so fast. Mrs. Jenkins just... She wouldn't let me go." Samantha tightened her grip. "You did the right thing. Whatever's going on, we'll figure it out." Heather nodded, her eyes red-rimmed but determined. "I just don't understand. Why does she care so much about keeping me under her thumb? It's just a stupid flower stand job." Samantha's jaw clenched. "It's not about the job. It's about control. She knows something, Heather. Something we don't." Heather swallowed hard. "What do we do now?" "We go home," Samantha said softly. "You can stay with me. You'll be safe there." Heather hesitated, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. "Your world. It's not mine." "It doesn't matter," Samantha said firmly. "You're my sister. My home is yours." Heather nodded slowly. "Okay." The ride back to the penthouse was a blur. Samantha's mind raced with thoughts, each one more troubling than the last. Who was Mrs. Jenkins really? Why was she so invested in Heather's life? And what was she hiding when they stepped into the marble lobby? The air felt cool and sterile. Heather shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting around the opulent space. "It's a lot," she admitted. Samantha smiled gently. "You get used to it. Come on, let's go upstairs." They took the elevator up to the 32nd floor, the hum of the machinery filling the silence between them. When the doors opened, John Reed was waiting in the hallway, his face etched with worry. "Heather," he breathed, his voice shaky. "You're safe." Heather's eyes narrowed, her posture stiffening. "For now." John flinched but nodded, his gaze filled with regret. "I know you don't trust me, but I'm so glad you're here." Heather didn't respond. Samantha stepped between them. "Dad, we need to talk, in private." John nodded. "My office." Heather hesitated. "I'll wait in the living room." Samantha squeezed her arm. "I won't be long." Heather walked away, her shoulders tense. Samantha followed her father into his office, closing the door behind them. John turned to face her, his eyes shadowed. "Tell me everything." Samantha took a deep breath. Mrs. Jenkins was trying to control Heather. She wouldn't let her leave the park. It was like she had a hold on her. John's face hardened. This isn't a coincidence. Someone put her there for a reason. Who? Samantha demanded. And why Heather? He rubbed his temples. I don't know, but I have a feeling this goes back to the kidnapping. Someone took Heather all those years ago, and now they're trying to keep her from us. Samantha's stomach churned. You think Mrs. Jenkins knows who took her? Yes, he said grimly, and we need to find out what she knows. A thought struck Samantha, cold and sharp. What if Heather's still in danger? John's eyes met hers, dark with fear. Then we have to protect her no matter what. Samantha returned to the living room, where Heather sat on the edge of the couch, her hands twisting in her lap. She looked up, her eyes wary. What did he say? We think Mrs. Jenkins knows more than she's letting on, Samantha said. And we're going to figure out what it is. Heather's fingers tightened around the butterfly pendant. I don't want to be a pawn in some twisted game. You're not a pawn, Samantha assured her. You're my sister, and we're going to get through this together. Heather's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. I don't know how you're so sure about that. Because I have to be, Samantha said. For both of us. Heather nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. Okay, I trust you. The words were fragile, but they were a start. Samantha felt a swell of determination. Whatever it took, she was going to keep Heather safe. That night, Samantha lay awake in her bed, the city lights casting faint shadows across the ceiling. Sleep felt impossible. Her mind was a storm of questions, doubts, and fears. A soft knock on her door broke the silence. She sat up. Come in. Heather peeked inside, her eyes hesitant. I can't sleep. Me neither, Samantha admitted. Come in. Heather slipped into the room and sat on the edge of the bed. They were quiet for a moment, the weight of everything unspoken pressing down on them. Do you think we'll ever be normal? Heather asked, her voice small. Samantha smiled sadly. I don't know, but maybe normal isn't what we need. Maybe we just need to be real. Heather nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. I can live with that. Samantha reached out and took her hand. We're not alone anymore. That's what matters. Heather squeezed her fingers. Yeah, that's what matters. They sat together in the dark, two sisters clinging to the fragile threads of hope. Outside, the city moved on, unaware of the storm brewing within the walls of the Reed penthouse. But inside, a bond was forming, one that no secret, no lie, could ever break. The first rays of sunlight crept through the curtains, painting the room in a soft amber glow. Samantha blinked awake, the unfamiliar weight beside her reminding her of last night. Heather was still asleep, curled up on the edge of the bed, her face relaxed for the first time in days. Samantha's heart swelled with a protective fierceness she hadn't known she was capable of. She slipped out of bed carefully, not wanting to wake her sister. Moving to the window, she gazed out at the city below. The streets were already alive with people chasing their routines, unaware of the tangled web of secrets unraveling above them. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. She grabbed it quickly and stepped out into the hallway, closing the door behind her. It was a message from her father, John Reed. We need to talk. Meet me in the office. A chill ran through her. She texted back a quick confirmation and headed toward his office, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. When she entered, John was standing by the window. His shoulders tense, hands gripping a steaming cup of coffee. He turned, his eyes dark with exhaustion. I found something. Samantha's pulse quickened. About Mrs. Jenkins. He nodded, setting the coffee cup on the desk. Her real name is Margaret Jennings. She used to work for one of my competitors back in the day, Charles Whitmore. Samantha's eyes widened. Whitmore Industries, the company you took over a few years ago. John's jaw tightened. Yes, it wasn't a friendly acquisition. Whitmore was ruined. His business, his reputation, everything. Margaret was his personal assistant for years. She lost everything when the company fell. Samantha's stomach twisted. So this is revenge. I think so, John said grimly. But it's more than that. I found records showing that Margaret disappeared around the same time Heather was kidnapped. I think she was involved from the start. Samantha's mind raced. She took Heather to punish you. John's face contorted with guilt. I believe so. And now, she's been keeping an eye on Heather all these years, making sure she stayed out of our lives. Samantha clenched her fists. We have to confront her. John nodded. I have a plan, but it's risky. I don't care, Samantha said fiercely. Heather deserves to know the truth. He met her gaze, pride and regret mingling in his eyes. We'll do this together. But we have to be careful. Margaret is dangerous. Samantha took a deep breath, her determination hardening like steel. We can't let her win. Back in the living room, Heather sat on the couch, her arms wrapped around her knees. She looked up when Samantha entered, worry clouding her eyes. What's going on? Samantha sat beside her, hesitating for only a moment. We know who Mrs. Jenkins really is. Her real name is Margaret Jennings. She used to work for someone who hated our father. Heather's brows knit together. So, she kidnapped me because of a business feud. Yeah, Samantha said softly. It wasn't about you. It was about hurting Dad. Heather's face hardened. That doesn't make it any better. I know, Samantha whispered. But we're going to stop her. Dad has a plan. Heather's eyes flickered with uncertainty. A plan? What kind of plan? To confront her, Samantha explained. To make sure she can't hurt you, or us, ever again. Heather shivered. I don't know if I can face her. Samantha reached for her hand. You don't have to. You can stay here. Stay safe. Heather shook her head. No, I'm tired of running. I need to see this through. Samantha's heart swelled with pride. Okay, we'll do it together. The plan was simple, but dangerous. John had arranged for Margaret to meet him in a private office downtown under the guise of a business proposal. Samantha and Heather would wait nearby, ready to confront her when the time was right. The drive to the office building was tense. Heather stared out the window, her fingers tapping restlessly on her thigh. Samantha reached over and squeezed her hand. We've got this. Heather nodded, though her eyes betrayed her fear. I hope so. They arrived at the sleek glass building and took the elevator to the 20th floor. The hallway was quiet, the air thick with anticipation. John was already inside, waiting for Margaret to arrive. Are you ready? Samantha asked Heather. Heather took a shaky breath. As ready as I'll ever be. A few minutes later, the sound of heels clicking on the marble floor echoed toward them. Samantha's stomach twisted. Margaret Jennings appeared at the end of the hallway, her expression cold and composed. Her sharp gray eyes narrowed when she saw the two sisters standing side by side. I didn't expect to see you here, Margaret said. Her voice clipped. Heather stepped forward, her voice trembling but strong. Why did you do this to me? Margaret's eyes flicked to Samantha, then back to Heather. You wouldn't understand. Try me, Heather shot back, her hands balled into fists. Margaret's mask of composure cracked, revealing the bitterness beneath. Your father destroyed everything I had, everything I worked for. You were just a tool to make him pay. Heather's face contorted with rage and hurt. I'm not a tool. I'm a person. You stole my life. Margaret's lips curled into a sneer. And I'd do it again. Samantha's voice rang out, cold and clear. And no, you won't. It's over, Margaret. Behind her, the sound of approaching footsteps grew louder. Security guards appeared, flanking Margaret before she could react. John stepped out of the office, his eyes filled with pain and determination. You're done. Margaret's shoulders slumped as the guards led her away. The fight drained from her eyes. Heather sagged with relief, tears streaming down her cheeks. Samantha wrapped her arms around her sister, holding her tightly. It's over, Samantha whispered. You're free. Heather clung to her, her voice breaking. Finally. The door clicked shut, leaving Samantha and Heather standing in the quiet hallway. The air still buzzed with tension, the echoes of Margaret's venomous words hanging like a dark cloud. Heather's eyes were red and puffy, her face etched with exhaustion and disbelief. Samantha kept her arm wrapped around her sister's shoulders, offering what little comfort she could. You okay? Samantha asked softly. Heather let out a shaky breath. I don't know. I feel numb. Samantha nodded, her own emotions swirling in confusion. It's a lot to process, but it's over. She can't hurt you anymore. Heather's jaw clenched. I just don't understand how someone could be so cruel. How could she ruin my life just to get back at him? There's no making sense of it, Samantha replied. Some people let their bitterness consume them, but that's not going to happen to us. Heather looked at her, a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. Us. Samantha smiled gently. Yeah, Us. You and me. We're in this together now. Heather's shoulders relaxed a fraction, and she nodded. Okay? John stepped out of the office. His face lined with guilt and relief. He approached them slowly, his eyes flicking to Heather, then back to Samantha. She's in custody. The police will take it from here. Heather's gaze hardened. Good. John took a tentative step closer. Heather, I don't know how to apologize for everything you've been through. Heather's eyes narrowed. You can't apologize for 18 years of pain, Mr. Reed. He flinched at the formal address, his hands trembling slightly. I know, but I want to try to make things right. If you'll let me. She studied him, her expression unreadable. I don't know if I can forgive you, not yet. That's fair, he said quietly. I just want you to know that I'm here, whenever you're ready. Heather nodded. A small, reluctant acknowledgement. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a beginning. Samantha squeezed her sister's shoulder. Let's go home. Heather's lips twitched into a faint smile. Home? That sounds weird. We'll figure out what that means, Samantha assured her. Together, the ride back to the penthouse was quiet, the hum of the car engine filling the silence between them. Heather leaned her forehead against the window, watching the city blur past. Samantha sat beside her, trying to find the right words, but coming up empty. What could she say that would make any of this better? When they stepped into the penthouse, the familiar scent of polished wood and fresh flowers filled the air. Heather hesitated in the doorway, her eyes scanning the opulent surroundings. It's too much, she whispered. I don't belong here. Samantha turned to her, her voice firm but gentle. You belong wherever you want to be. This is just a place. What matters is that you're safe. Heather nodded slowly, her fingers brushing against the butterfly pendant around her neck. I guess I'm still trying to figure out what safe feels like. Take your time, Samantha said. There's no rush. They settled in the living room, the sprawling skyline of Manhattan glittering through the windows. Heather sank into the plush couch, her body sagging with exhaustion. Samantha sat beside her, the silence stretching out, but this time it didn't feel oppressive. After a while, Heather spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. What now? Samantha hesitated. We take it one day at a time. You don't have to decide everything right now. Heather looked at her, a flicker of fear in her eyes. What if I don't know who I am without all the chaos? Samantha's heart ached. Then we'll figure it out together. You don't have to have all the answers, neither do I. Heather nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I'm scared, Sam. Me too, Samantha admitted. But we're not alone anymore. We have each other. Heather's lips trembled, and then, for the first time, she let herself lean into Samantha's embrace. The dam broke, and sobs racked her body, years of pain and fear pouring out all at once. Samantha held her tightly, her own tears slipping down her cheeks. It's okay, Samantha whispered. Let it out. I'm here. They stayed like that for what felt like hours, the weight of the past finally lifting. Piece by piece, the darkness that had clouded their lives for so long was beginning to dissipate, replaced by something fragile, but real. Hope. Later that night, Samantha made hot chocolate, the warmth of the mug seeping into their hands. They sat on the balcony, the cold air biting at their cheeks, but neither of them cared. The view stretched out before them, endless possibilities glimmering in the city lights. Heather took a sip, the steam curling around her face. I still don't know what I want my life to be. That's okay, Samantha said. You get to decide now, no one else? Heather nodded, her eyes thoughtful. Maybe I'll go back to school, or maybe I'll keep working with flowers. I like how simple they are. Whatever makes you happy, Samantha said. Smiling, Heather turned to her, her gaze steady. What about you? What do you want? Samantha's smile faltered. I want to stop pretending, to stop living my life according to everyone else's expectations. Heather smirked. Sounds like we both have some rebuilding to do. Samantha chuckled. Yeah. But at least we're not doing it alone. They clinked their mugs together, a silent toast to new beginnings. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with questions and challenges, but for the first time, it didn't feel impossible. Together, they would rebuild, they would heal, and maybe, just maybe, they would find the peace they both deserved. Morning light streamed into the penthouse, casting a golden glow over the sleek surfaces and plush furnishings. Heather stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, her arms wrapped around herself. The city sprawled beneath her, vibrant and alive, but she felt like an outsider peering into a world that didn't belong to her. Samantha walked into the room, 2 steaming mugs of coffee in her hands. She paused, watching Heather's silhouette against the skyline. There was a quiet strength in her sister, a resilience that made Samantha both proud and heartbroken. "Coffee," Samantha offered softly. Heather turned, a faint smile on her lips. "Thanks." She took the mug, the warmth seeping into her fingers. "You always drink this fancy stuff," Samantha chuckled. "It's just coffee." Heather raised an eyebrow. "No, it's rich coffee." Samantha rolled her eyes playfully. "Okay, maybe it's a little fancy." They settled on the couch, the silence between them comfortable now. Samantha sipped her coffee, her thoughts swirling with the events of the past few days. The confrontation with Margaret, the revelations about their family, the fragile steps toward healing. It all felt surreal. Heather set her mug down, her fingers tracing the rim. "I've been thinking." Samantha turned to her, bracing herself. "About what?" "About what I want to do next," Heather said, her voice tentative. "I can't stay here forever. I need to figure out who I am, outside of all this." Samantha's heart squeezed. The thought of Heather leaving terrified her, but she knew it was inevitable. "Where will you go?" Heather sighed, her gaze distant. "Maybe back to the flower stand, or maybe somewhere new. A fresh start. You don't have to figure it out right away," Samantha said gently. "You can stay as long as you want." Heather's eyes softened. "I know, but I need to stand on my own feet. I spent so long being controlled by someone else. I need to know what freedom feels like." Samantha nodded, her throat tight. "I get it, and I'll support whatever you decide." Heather smiled, a real, genuine smile. "You're not as bad as I thought you'd be." Samantha laughed, blinking back tears. "Gee, thanks." They sat quietly for a moment, the weight of their bond settling into something solid and unbreakable. Samantha took a deep breath. "Dad wants to see you again. No pressure." "But he asked." Heather's smile faded. She stared into her coffee, her expression conflicted. "I don't know if I'm ready." "That's okay," Samantha said. "It's your choice." Heather looked up, her eyes clear and steady. "Maybe someday, but not now." Samantha nodded, a wave of relief washing over her. "Whenever you're ready." That afternoon, Samantha convinced Heather to take a walk with her. They strolled through Central Park, the bare branches of the trees reaching toward a pale winter sky. The air was crisp, their breath misting in front of them. Heather's eyes wandered over the familiar paths and benches. "It feels different now." "What does?" Samantha asked. "The park," Heather said quietly. "I used to walk these paths and feel invisible, like I didn't matter now. It feels like there's a thread connecting me to something real." Samantha smiled. "You do matter. You always did." Heather kicked at a pebble on the path. "I guess I just didn't know it." They passed by the bench where they'd first spoken. Heather paused, her eyes lingering on it. "I almost didn't talk to you that day." Samantha followed her gaze. "I'm glad you did." Heather's voice softened. "Me too." They continued walking, the sound of their footsteps blending with the distant chatter of children playing and dogs barking. For the first time, the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt like a beginning. That evening, back in the penthouse, John Reed stood in the doorway of the living room, watching his daughters with a mixture of hope and regret. Heather was flipping through a book on flowers, her brow furrowed in concentration. Samantha sat beside her, pointing out something and making Heather laugh. John cleared his throat. "May I join you?" Heather's smile faded, but she nodded. "Sure." He sat down in the armchair across from them, his hands clasped together. "I just wanted to say how proud I am of both of you. The strength you've shown. It humbles me." Heather's eyes were guarded, but she listened. John continued, his voice thick with emotion. "I know I can't undo the past, but I hope someday you'll let me be part of your future." Heather's fingers tightened around the book. "I don't know if I can forgive you. Not yet." He nodded, his eyes glistening. "I understand. Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere." Samantha reached over and took Heather's hand. Giving it a reassuring squeeze, Heather glanced at her, then back at John. Maybe we can start with small steps. John's face lit up with cautious hope. I'd like that. Heather nodded, a flicker of vulnerability crossing her face. Okay, it wasn't a reconciliation, but it was a start. And sometimes, a start was all you needed. That night, Samantha and Heather sat on the balcony again, the city lights twinkling like a blanket of stars. The air was cold, but they didn't mind. Heather took a deep breath. Tomorrow, I think I'll go back to the flower stand, just for a little while. I need to say goodbye to that part of my life. Samantha smiled. I'll go with you. Heather's eyes softened. Thanks, Sam. Samantha leaned back, the weight of uncertainty lifting slightly. We're going to be okay. Heather nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. Yeah, we are. They sat together in the dark, the future stretching out before them, uncertain, but filled with possibility, and for the first time, they were ready to face it. Together, the morning air was crisp as Samantha and Heather made their way toward the flower stand. The streets of Manhattan bustled with energy, but a quiet determination hung between the two sisters. Heather walked with her hands tucked into the pockets of her worn sweater, Samantha's coat still draped over her shoulders. As they rounded the corner, the familiar sight of the flower stand came into view. Buckets of daisies, roses, and carnations sat in neat rows, their colors vibrant against the gray of the city. Heather's eyes softened, a wave of nostalgia washing over her. This place was my whole world for a long time, she murmured. Samantha glanced at her, sensing the weight of the moment. You don't have to let it go if you're not ready. Heather shook her head. I think I am. I need to say goodbye to this chapter. It's the only way I can move forward. They approached the stand, and Heather stepped behind the counter. She ran her fingers over the worn wood, memories flickering across her face. Early mornings, cold winters, lonely nights. This place had been her anchor when everything else felt adrift. A voice called out behind them, Heather. They turned to see Mrs. Morales, a kind-hearted older woman who owned the newsstand across the street. Her eyes widened in surprise. You're back, Heather smiled faintly. For a little while. Mrs. Morales walked over, her gaze flicking between Heather and Samantha. It's good to see you, Mija. You disappeared so suddenly. Heather's jaw tightened. Things got complicated. Mrs. Morales nodded knowingly. Life has a way of doing that. But you're strong. You always have been. Heather swallowed hard. Thanks, Mrs. Morales. The older woman patted Heather's shoulder gently. Take care of yourself, okay? You deserve good things. As Mrs. Morales walked back to her newsstand, Heather's eyes shimmered. Samantha reached out and squeezed her hand. You ready? Heather nodded, though her voice trembled. Yeah. She took a deep breath and began gathering the flowers, her movements slow and deliberate. Each bloom she picked up seemed to hold a memory, a fragment of the life she was leaving behind. Samantha helped her, the two of them working in quiet synchronicity. As they filled the last bucket, Heather exhaled shakily. It feels weird, like I'm erasing part of myself. You're not erasing it, Samantha said gently. You're honoring it, and making room for something new. Heather looked at her, a tear slipping down her cheek. How did you get so wise? Samantha chuckled softly. I'm making it up as I go. They shared a smile, the bond between them growing stronger with each passing moment. Heather wiped her eyes and stepped back from the stand. I'm ready to go. Are you sure? Samantha asked. Heather nodded. Yeah, let's go home. They walked back to the penthouse in silence, the weight of the morning pressing on them both. When they stepped inside, John was waiting in the living room, his eyes filled with cautious hope. Heather hesitated in the doorway, her fingers tightening around the strap of her bag. I packed up the flower stand, she said quietly. I'm done with it. John nodded, his voice soft. I'm proud of you. Heather's eyes flickered with uncertainty. I don't know what comes next. That's okay, John said. You don't have to figure it out alone. Heather took a deep breath, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. I guess that's a start, John smiled, the lines on his face softening. It is. Samantha watched the exchange, a sense of peace settling in her chest. The pieces were beginning to fit together, slowly, imperfectly, but together nonetheless. Later that evening, the three of them sat down for dinner, The table was set simply, the air filled with the aroma of roasted chicken and vegetables. It wasn't the usual lavish meal the Reeds were known for, but it felt right. It felt real. Heather poked at her food, a small smile playing on her lips. I haven't had a real family dinner in forever. John's voice was thick with emotion. I'm glad you're here. Heather looked up, her eyes meeting his. Me too. They ate quietly, the silence not awkward but healing. Each bite, each glance, each small gesture was a step toward something better, a chance to rebuild what had been broken. After dinner, they moved to the living room. John poured cups of tea, and the three of them settled into the plush couches. Heather leaned back, her eyes heavy with exhaustion but peaceful. I never thought I'd have this, she admitted. A family, a place to belong. Samantha smiled, her heart full. You do now. Heather nodded, her fingers brushing the butterfly pendant. Yeah, I do. John's voice was soft. Thank you for giving us a chance, Heather. She looked at him, her eyes shining. I'm still figuring it out, but I think I want to try. John's face lit up with hope, and Samantha felt tears prick her eyes. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was theirs, and that was enough. As the night settled around them, the city lights twinkling beyond the windows, the Reed family sat together, a little broken, a little healed, but undeniably whole. The pale light of dawn seeped through the windows, casting a gentle glow over the penthouse living room. Samantha stretched on the couch, the remnants of sleep clinging to her. The memories of the past few days felt like a whirlwind. Secrets uncovered, bonds formed, and old wounds beginning to heal. She blinked a few times, reality settling in with a comforting weight. She glanced over and saw Heather curled up in an armchair, still asleep. Her face was peaceful. The lines of tension that usually creased her brow finally softened. A quiet warmth filled Samantha's chest. For the first time, they both belonged to something real, something unbreakable. The soft clink of a cup made her turn. Her father, John, was standing by the kitchen island, 2 mugs of coffee in his hands. He smiled faintly and held one out to her. Morning, he said softly. Morning, she replied, taking the mug and savoring the warmth against her palms. He leaned against the counter, his gaze settling on Heather. She looks so much like your mother. Samantha nodded. I see it too. John's expression grew distant, a mixture of regret and hope flickering in his eyes. I lost so much time. I'll never get those years back. Samantha's voice was gentle but firm. But you have now, and that's what matters. He smiled sadly. I hope she believes that someday. Samantha took a sip of coffee, the bitterness grounding her. She's trying. That's all we can ask for. Heather stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She blinked in confusion for a moment, before her gaze found Samantha and John. A small, sleepy smile tugged at her lips. Morning, Heather murmured, stretching. Morning, Samantha said, smiling back. Coffee? Heather nodded, sitting up. Yeah, thanks. John handed her a mug, his movements tentative, as if afraid he might break the fragile peace between them. Heather took it, her fingers brushing his briefly. She didn't pull away. They sat together in the living room, the silence filled with the clink of mugs and the faint hum of the city waking up around them. It was a silence that spoke of healing, of possibility. The weight of the past hadn't disappeared, but it felt lighter now, more manageable. Heather glanced out the window, her eyes thoughtful. I've been thinking about what's next. Samantha's heart clenched. Yeah, Heather nodded. I want to go back to the flower stand. Just for a little while. I need to say goodbye properly. On my own terms this time. John's brow furrowed, but he nodded. If that's what you need, I understand. Heather's eyes met his. A spark of tentative trust there. It is. Samantha swallowed the lump in her throat. Do you want me to come with you? Heather shook her head, a small smile on her lips. No, I need to do this alone. Samantha nodded, though it hurt to think of Heather walking away, even for a little while. Okay, but if you need me, I'm just a call away. I know, Heather said softly. A few hours later, Samantha stood by the window, watching Heather walk toward the street. She wore Samantha's old coat, her head held high. Each step she took was a declaration of independence, of strength, of survival. Samantha felt a surge of pride and a bittersweet ache. She'll be back, John said behind her, his voice filled with quiet certainty. Samantha nodded. I know, but it still feels like letting go. Sometimes letting go is the hardest part of love, he said. But she's not gone forever. Samantha turned to face him, her eyes shining. Neither are we. John's smile was soft, the lines on his face seeming less heavy. No, we're not. Heather's footsteps echoed on the pavement as she approached the flower stand. It looked smaller than she remembered. The colors a little less vibrant, the memories a little less sharp, but it was still hers, a piece of her past that she could finally lay to rest. She took a deep breath and began unpacking the buckets, arranging the flowers with care. Each bloom felt like a part of herself, the pain, the survival, the hope. Mrs. Morales waved from across the street, her warm smile a beacon of familiarity. Good to see you back, Mija, she called. Heather smiled. Good to be back. For the first time, she felt like she was in control of her life. The shadows of Margaret's manipulation were fading, replaced by something brighter. She wasn't defined by what had happened to her. She was defined by what she chose to do now. She arranged a bouquet of daisies and roses, the petals soft against her fingers. A sense of peace settled over her. This was her goodbye. To the fear, to the uncertainty, to the part of her that had always felt lost. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and smiled when she saw the message from Samantha. Samantha, I'm proud of you. Always here if you need me. Heather's heart swelled. For the first time in her life, she wasn't alone. She had a sister, a family, a future. The road ahead was still uncertain, but now she was ready to walk it. She typed a reply. Heather, thank you. I'll see you soon. With a deep breath, she tucked her phone away and turned back to the flowers. The world was wide open, and for the first time, she felt ready to embrace it.